Recording now. On the count of 3 for broadcast. 3, 2, 1.
Hi everyone, welcome to the University of Sydney's masterclasses. We'll just wait for everyone to join the session. As you're all joining the session, I'll just give you a little bit of a background on what the event is here tonight. So the masterclass sessions that we host are for students who are interested in postgraduate study at the University of Sydney, and they're intended to give you a bit of a deeper look at what it's going to be like to study here. You'll get to meet an academic who teaches in the program and find out a little bit about a particular topic that is taught in the program and how that's relevant in the context of today's world. We'll wait a little bit longer as everyone joins in. The session today will be going through a presentation, and then there'll be an opportunity to participate and interact in a discussion at the end of the session. Just wait a couple more moments for the last few people to enter into the room, and then I'll introduce our speaker for this evening's masterclass. Okay, well, I think we might get started now. So I'd like to introduce to you Associate Professor Gabby Ramia, who's the Director of the Public Policy Program in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at the University of Sydney. And the masterclass that he'll be presenting tonight is Public Policy and the Real World. So over to you, Gabby.
Thanks so much, Liz. Welcome everyone, it's a pleasure to be with you. Those are my details. So Liz has given you the title of tonight's masterclass. Those are my details, and you're very welcome at any stage to get in contact with me. I'm sure you're going to have lots of questions on your mind. We may not get a lot of time for question and answer today, with the exception of an exercise, a discussion exercise, which we'll have a little bit of it at the beginning. We'll have a video at the beginning and discussion at the end in light of what we discuss in between. But you're very welcome to get in touch with me. Very welcome to follow me on Twitter if you're interested in some of the issues that we're talking about tonight. I am, by the way, the academic who's responsible for the public policy program. So I'm the one you initially get in touch with. And if I'm not the right person, then I'm happy to put you on to other people who are right for your particular inquiry. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I'm currently, well, the one I live on, and the one I work on, which is the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And I acknowledge their elders, past, present, and emerging. So the class plan for tonight, I'll say something very, very briefly to you about the course structure. And again, I stress that I know that there must be lots and lots of questions about the structure and the requirements of the course, what kind of choices you have, but I just want to give you a very brief snapshot before we go into the actual material that we'll be discussing. I'm going to give you 4 major concepts that I think are absolutely at the center of the topic of public policy, and so naturally they are at the center of the coursework that you will do in the Master of Public Policy. So the first concept is that of policy itself. The second is that of politics. The third is that of governance, and the fourth is that of administration. Now, what I'm going to stress all the way through, but certainly at this point here, is that these terms are not mutually exclusive, and I'm not going to offer you definitive definitions of any of them, but what I'm going to do is highlight the importance of them so that by the end of this masterclass, hopefully you get a sense of each of them. And what I hope to do is give you a very good idea of what's in the public policy program to pique your interest and to hopefully engage with you on the subject matter. So the course requirements. There are a few kind of requirements that you would need to meet, and I think the most important ones are these. You have 2 what we call core units. These are the ones that you must do in your master's program. The master's program as a total is 96 credit points, or the equivalent of 2 full-time years of coursework. Now, it's possible, as I say at the bottom of this screen, it's possible to have reduced volume of learning where your program is essentially cut down by either 1 semester or even 2 semesters. If, for example, you've got an honours degree in a relevant discipline in your undergraduate, and the equivalent of an Australian honours in your undergraduate. But your 2 core units that you must do, one is called the politics of policy making. The second is called public management and governance. Much of what those 2 units represent is discussed tonight. So what I'm giving you is a very small flavour of, very brief flavour, hopefully an interesting flavour of the core of this program. You must also do then a minimum, if you're doing the 96 credit point or 2-year full-time version, it's a minimum of 5 units or 30 credit points of what we call core electives, and a maximum of 8 units or 48 credit points from elective units. And those elective units can be very, very wide ranging. They can contribute to a specialization, and I've given you the 4 principal specializations that we recommend. There are others that you can choose from, but your 4 primaries are social policy, international policy, economic policy, and media and cultural policy. Now, you don't have to do a specialization. That's just if you choose to do one. That structures your electives a little bit more. You also need to do what we say is a minimum of 6 credit points or 1 subject worth of a capstone, which is an in-depth research project. For the better students, the really keen students, the ones who might leave the door open to an application for a PhD at the end, you would do 12 credit points of capstone, which is a slightly more in-depth research project. I hope that's a little bit informative in any case. As I said, it's a shame that we don't have time to really talk about the structure of the course more. I would basically recommend to you, if you're really interested, to have those discussions. We do have a series of events during the year, and I'm sure we will have one early next year. Very briefly now, what I'm going to do is going to show you a 2-minute video, which is kind of going to structure quite a bit of our discussion. It certainly will, if not structure it, it will get us hopefully to see the relevance to what's going on around us right here and now. So I'm going to stop sharing that just for a moment, and I'm going to share this video, which is embedded in an article in The Guardian newspaper. Oops. I'm going to stop sharing and try again. Now, I hope you can see that really well.
Problem in this country at this moment? Well, we pretty much shut it down coming in from China. We're going to see what happens, but we did shut it down, yes.
You know, a lot of people think that goes away in April with the heat, as the heat comes in. We're in great shape, though.
And you know, in April, supposedly it dies with the hotter weather.
Looks like by April, you know, in theory, when it gets a little warmer, it miraculously goes away. I hope that's true.
And I think the numbers are going to get progressively better as we go along.
We have it very much under control in this country.
Because of all we've done, the risk to the American people remains very low. It's going to disappear. One day, it's like a miracle. It will disappear. You know, it could get worse before it gets better. It could maybe go away. We'll see what happens. Nobody really knows.
Now the Democrats are politicizing the coronavirus. You know that, right? Coronavirus. And this is their new hoax.
The hoax is on them. I'm not talking about what's happening here. Certainly not referring to this. How could anybody refer to this? This is very serious.
Anybody that needs a test can have a test. They're all set.
Are you concerned that the virus is getting closer to
No, I'm not concerned at all. No.
It will go away. Just stay calm. It will go away. To keep new cases from entering our shores, we will be suspending all travel from Europe to the United States for the next 30 days. This is the most aggressive and comprehensive effort to confront a foreign virus in modern history. We're in great shape compared to other places. We are in really good shape. Yeah, no, I don't take responsibility at all. It's all over the world. It's incredible what's happened in such a short period of time. But I've always known this is a pandemic.
Okay, I'm going to share my slides again now. So let's keep that particular video in mind. We'll come back to it at the end, but what I'm going to ask you at the end, in a brief sort of 10-minute masterclass discussion with you, at which point I'll ask you if you're comfortable to do so, to turn on your cameras. I should say, and my apologies that I didn't say at the beginning, we are recording this lecture. So if that presents any issues for you in terms of video or being seen on this masterclass, please bear that in mind. So we're going to come back to that video just in terms of policy failure, and then we're going to, in the meantime, what we're going to do is we're going to discuss some policy principles that will help us interpret what's going wrong in the US response to COVID-19 on the back of some snippets of what President Trump, someone who is still President Trump, despite the fact that he is meant to leave office in January. So the question I'm going to ask you at the end is, what's gone wrong in the US policy response to COVID-19? In your answer, refer to our 4 central concepts that I've mentioned to you, and I'm going to discuss now. What we're going to look for is, at the very least, one failure in terms of each of those dimensions of public policy. So what is public policy? I'm going to try to be quick here, but not so quick that it loses its meaning and it becomes less easy to kind of put it all together. That might mean that I might skip a slide or two, but I hope that's okay with you. What I want to make sure is that what I say is comprehensive, but at the same time that there's not too much content and that it becomes a manageable sort of half hour from here, or a little bit less than half an hour. Just as I said, a snippet. So what's public policy? First of all, first thing to say, it's an ambiguous term. What is a policy is a really relevant question. If we are sticking with examples from the US President, Donald Trump, then he has been announcing policy on Twitter. He's probably the first president to do so. You could say, on some definitions, he is making policy on social media. That's something that perhaps we can discuss at another time. If you enroll, I'd be very, very happy to have that discussion with you. But it's ambiguous in the sense that there are various places and ways that policy announcements can be made. But in the meantime, we must understand the policy, the policy process that policymakers go through. So it's what we could say public policy is what governments choose to do, and importantly, not to do about particular societal, economic, and political problems. It's how they address those problems, essentially. But it could also be the choice not to act, as much as it is the choice to act. Could also be the choice to act in ways which are really unwise, as we can see in our initial video. So it's shaped by various forces, various interests in society and in the political and economic systems that we exist alongside. By politicians, public servants, community interests, the media of the traditional kind, but also the social media kind, by corporations, by market forces. Generally, we could say that public policy is about the interaction between people, institutions, and markets. It's made through a mix of what you could say is very unlikely means of what would constitute a policy. A policy could be an authoritative choice. It could be a hypothesis that is made by a policymaker or a politician. It could be a series of objectives. It could be, on some definitions, an announcement that's made on social media. So, but look, in terms of making policy, what do we make policy through? What institutions are those that help us to understand the making of policy? And again, there's a lot more to discover through the course of the Masters in Public Policy, but most states or most countries or most national political systems are really governed by three sets of institutions or three main institutions. And one of them is the legislature, which essentially makes the laws that we're governed by, which is exercised by Parliament through the Houses of Parliament or the House of Parliament if you've got a unicameral system. There's also the executive, which administers and enforces the law. There we're talking about the government, the ministers, the administrative agencies of government. Then there's also, importantly, the judiciary. The judiciary is essentially the legal profession. It applies and interprets the laws on a case-by-case system. The guts of it is the courts system that helps to make the laws, which are then interpreted by other aspects of the state. Now, let me say that the best kind of democratic systems are the ones that neatly separate the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. The US does this. It's probably a model for doing that. Australia, on the other hand, combines the legislature with the executive because the executive sits within the parliament, which creates some interesting phenomena that we can also talk about through the course of the Masters in Public Policy. We will certainly have means to do so and a call to do so. So what is our system essentially governed by? What kind of constitution, small c or large c, you might ask, are we governed under? First thing to say is we have what's called a bicameral system. Cameral meaning two major rooms. First of all, an upper house and a lower house of Parliament. They're the two houses of Parliament. We also have a sovereign or a head of state who technically has very wide reserve powers, and those powers sit with the Governor-General, not with the Prime Minister. The Governor-General sits at the Commonwealth level. At the state level, we also have governors who do a similar representation of the royal family, the Queen essentially, at the national level and at the state level respectively. We also have a head of government, unofficially the head of the executive, also known as the Prime Minister at the federal level, the national level, or the Premier at the state level. Now, that person who's in charge of the jurisdiction, as they call it, sits within the Parliament. And as I said, that's one of the defining features of our system, which is a version of the Westminster system, which we get from the UK, from Britain. But we share some important similarities with the US system. We have states, for example, which formally speaking, the UK does not. We have an upper house, which functions very, very differently to the upper house in the UK, which is the House of Lords in their case. But each of our states has a premier, and our executive branch is made up of members of Parliament who are senior ministers, usually making up the cabinet, but of course there is a broader ministry. All of them sit in the Parliament. So just in terms of who are the policy actors. Now here I'm using a reference, and by the way, I'm very happy to pass on these slides to anyone who wants to request them. Perhaps through Liz, we can coordinate that process. I don't mind how that process is coordinated. I'm very happy to share these slides. One of our final slides has this reference from Althouse, Bridgman and Davis, a really terrific textbook for practitioners who sit typically in the public service. But what we're talking about with governmental or policy actors, there's a sphere which we call politics. In their particular framework, they highlight ministers and ministerial staff. There's the policy actors, which is the cabinet and the ministers. The ministers, of course, have a dual role, or at the very least a dual role. There's Prime Minister and Cabinet, there's department officials. There is also in the middle here, the Prime Minister and the various bits of machinery that sit around the Prime Minister's function. So you have the Prime Minister's private office, you have the Cabinet Policy Unit, you have the Secretary of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. But then this large red circle over here, and this is a Venn diagram. Venn diagram means that, of course, there's overlap between each of these categories, is the administration sphere. There we have departmental secretaries, Prime Minister and Cabinet Department, at the federal level, at the very least. We have finance, we have the Public Service Commission. What you get the sense of here is that there's no one policy maker, there's no one series of policy makers. Policy is made by, you know, a very wide and diffuse, diverse set of actors. We might come back to this before the end if we get the chance. To keep following that particular textbook, just because it provides a really, really good practical introduction, this is a really good example of not what happens in the real world in terms of policy, but what happens when we take a textbook model, which is, if you like, an ideal type, a model of the ideal type. If policy were to be made in a very rational way, this is an example of a model which it would follow. So we'd start off over here. I'm going to keep track of my time as we go, because I certainly don't want to go over time. We start off over here with the identification of issues. We're going to talk about this. It's called the policy agenda setting process, the policy agenda. That is about largely governments going from a very, very large set of policy problems that potentially they could tackle or choose to tackle. The process of narrowing down is to what they actually will attempt to tackle or will say that they will tackle, and that's the identification of issues, what will essentially be on their policy agenda. Once they have their policy agenda and they've chosen, let's say, one particular policy, they'll choose to either from the public service or from other forms of expertise, choose to analyse the options that they have, to assess the various merits, the relative merits of their options through various kinds of policy analysis. Once they've done their policy analysis, they'll seek to choose their policy tools or their policy instrument. So for example, will they choose a legal route? Will they choose legal instruments? Or will they choose an instrument called advocacy, where they'll seek to basically convince members of the public or the public at large of what they're doing? Will they choose the taxation instrument? Will there be economic policy instruments? There are various kinds of generic and also very specific policy instruments that we learn about in the first core unit, policy making unit, which will be in your first semester of enrolment, or if not first, then the second. So after the instruments are chosen, governments, if they're doing their job well in a democracy, they will seek to consult with the right sections, if not the entire Australian community, if we're talking about Australia in this particular case. So there will be a consultative phase. There have been over the years the development of more and more sophisticated and open and transparent mechanisms for that kind of consultation. Good politicians, good governments offer good consultation. Now, that's not always the case. Consultation is not always genuine. Consultation is, of course, like everything else in policy making, heavily politicised. But again, we will deal a lot with that through the course of the Masters. Once the consultation has taken place, that's a really good time to organise the public service through a coordination process to look at what particular departments or agencies, departments and agencies will work on this particular policy and what will they deliver and how will they deliver that product or that series of products to the making of a decision. And when we discuss this in the course, we're not simply talking about the announcement, which typically you might think is on the news. There are various institutions of decision making, ways of making decisions that are very much embedded in policy concepts. Once the decision is made and announced, then there'll be an implementation phase where they're basically seeking to put the policy into practice. After they've done that, then they'll seek, if they're doing their job, if we're on an ideal type model, to evaluate that policy. Once they've evaluated that policy, that provides a good basis to come back to the identification of issues, because we're starting a new policy process if we're doing our job really well as policymakers there. All right. So what we've done fairly quickly there, without problematizing some of the political issues and the political constraints that policymakers face, is basically what we've got is a very simplified model of how policy is made. Now, even that simplified model, I hope you'll agree with me, is not really available, it's not really accessible to the wider public. You'd have to read, you'd have to study it to appreciate it in its full, to the fullest. Now, taking ourselves from the concept of policy to the concept of governance. Consider the other policy actors that impact upon policy and policy decisions. So first of all, we can talk about what some call or refer to as the third sector, and some refer to as civil society. Civil society is that sector of society that sits somewhere between the market on the one hand, where corporations and consumers sit, and governmental circles on the other hand, which is where the state sphere is. This is everything in between. It's the collection of communities, of non-profit organisations, of community-based organisations and their representatives in political and social movements, everything that's not the market and not the state. We need a governance perspective in order to be able to understand that role and how it interacts with the state and with the market. We also can be talking about the media, the traditional media, the mainstream media, but also these days we talk much, much more about the influence of social media. Media these days is much, much more complex a set of institutions than it once was. We also talk about the market, and we also talk, if we use this kind of framework that I've been taking you through, we also talk about the interaction between politics, policy, and administration. According to that Althouse et al. Textbook, I would add the concept there of, as we are here, the concept of governance. Speaking of governance, what do we really mean by that? There's various takes that we can give to that, and we will offer a discussion of various different ways of viewing the concept of governance, how it works, what situations it might work well, what situations it doesn't, and its importance to policymakers. Now, I put it to you that the best way of understanding governance as opposed to policy is about what governments do in interaction with other parties, but it's essentially about the decisions that governments take. Governance gives us a way to decentralize that process. It's about the interaction between the state, civil society, and the market. And the interaction between these three gives us governance. Some will say, well, really that's a concept of public governance, but think of this. If you've got the state, that's really where we're dealing with public governance. If you've got civil society, then we're talking about organizational governance, for example, or the governance of community movements. If you're talking about the market, we can be talking about corporate governance. Public governance also is used as a concept to capture all of that, but let's try to understand that in simple terms as the concept of governance, the interaction between those three parties, those three sets of institutions, the state, civil society, and the market. Let's think about politics now in a slightly more formal way and in a slightly less simple and obvious way. So the video which I showed you at the beginning, of course, that's politics. That's one way we can understand politics. But understanding politics means having many, many more principles than simply understanding the decisions, or even if they be the poor decisions of leaders, whether they be world leaders or senior officials in the governments in whatever country. So what is the policy agenda? The policy agenda, as I said in the beginning, is the process that governments go through to arrive at that relatively small number of issues that they choose to deal with as a government. Usually, they announce their policy agenda shortly after being elected to government in democratic systems. But it could be potentially any one of a number of thousands and thousands of issues potentially. But it essentially represents the narrowing of those issues from those thousands and thousands to a more manageable number of issues which the government, as I said, chooses to focus on. How does it do that narrowing down process? First of all, it thinks about its issue drivers. So it thinks about the economy, media of various kinds, the opinion polls, shifts in law, changes in technology, and all the rest of it. Demographic developments within society. It thinks about what they call the issue attention cycle, as in how much do the people really want it? Will they be paying attention to it in a year's time, 2 years' time, etc.? Will they be paying attention to it at the next election, which is probably more the relevant question. They also deal with wicked problems in their agenda setting process. That is, the problems that have no particularly easy solution without major trade-offs. They also pay attention to the power and influence of political and economic interests. And this particularly is a really important part of the course that we identify at that first semester or that second semester in the politics of policy making. That is, how do we understand the power and influence of political and economic interests? Let me very briefly, and I say very briefly here because I don't want to spend too much time. I'm simplifying a whole bunch of other coursework that we will do through the course, throughout the course, and take you to the concept of administration. Administration is essentially about, for many, it's the process of implementing policy. It's the machinations of what happens within the political, but more so the public service sphere, the civil service sphere, as policy is implemented. But it's also about public sector management and the various branches of management that happen within government. Now, what I'll do here is I'll try to cut a very, very long story short by simply saying that going from the work of various theorists and practitioners about 100 years ago, 120 years ago in the case of some of them, we came up with a means to kind of cut out some of the corruption and to formalize government in what's more recently become known as traditional public administration. Again, this is an ideal type, but this is the kind of government that existed, kind of governmental system, public management system that existed before the 1980s and had its height, its golden era, if that's the term, after World War II and up to, say, the end of the 1970s. So you had an administration there, a public service that was under the formal control of political leadership. It was based on hierarchy, on rational models of bureaucracy. You had public servants who were typically permanent, neutral, anonymous. It has its various theoretical foundations in various parts of political science. But if anyone wants to read further in this area, I'd recommend the work of Max Weber. And there's a terrific presentation here. Sometimes the most easy to understand and informative presentations can be found online. This is a particularly informative one from a Turkish scholar. So along come the 1980s, lots of pressures on governments in terms of budget deficits, unemployment, particularly sticky economic problems. So there begins to be a greater focus on quantifiable results in government, of outcomes, outputs, and less emphasis on processes. We begin to see public sector management rise and the concept of administration declining. There's a focus on minimizing waste, enhancing efficiency, devolving control of issues to management itself. And importantly, senior management, especially from this stage, begins to see its security of employment broken down and its performance management all the way, especially when it comes to senior leadership in the public service. What we have now from, let's say, around about the turn of the century, let's say around about the year 2000, although its intellectual roots are in the 1990s, are what we call post-new public management or post-NPM. Various other ways that we see it theorized in the literature that we read. The other concept that you might read much, much more than others is either the neo-Weberian state sometimes, and more so again, new public governance. And here we're essentially combining elements of traditional administration with new public management, putting them together in a more consultative environment, in an environment where there's an emphasis on outputs, outcomes, but there's also an emphasis on the community understanding the policies that are made by government, communities being brought in to the policy making and administrative processes, more what they call deliberative democracy. This is where supposedly we are at as an ideal type right now. I'm going to take a little break there. I think we've been through quite a lot, but if you want to request my slides, I've got some useful readings that might interest you here, including this textbook that I referenced at the very beginning, but also some really interesting and important connections between theory and the real world, about agenda setting in this particular case, two different frameworks being compared, about, again, agendas through some really important work by an important policy author called John Kingdon. And then a blog entry for those of you who want to read something really brief but very, very informative, part of a much broader and more comprehensive blog by a terrific professor in Scotland called Paul Kearney, or Carney if they pronounce it that way.